Hello, welcome to Revive and Rise. I'm your host, Melody Parrish, and I'm so excited we have today with us Sara Aharon, and she is from Toronto, Canada. She is a health psychologist, a visual artist, and an author whose memoir is coming out in 2 days. And Sara, I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, I am very happy to be here and chat with you.
Great. So, just tell us a little about yourself.
Okay, so I've been practicing in the field in some form since about 1989. Um, I started with a focus on working with cancer patients and their families. And I've almost exclusively worked in that area for about 5 years. And then my mother passed away from breast cancer at age 56, and it became a bit too personal to just focus on that. So I decided to expand and look at other areas in terms of health psychology. I ended up working with people who've been in car accidents. So I've done that for a few years. And that was more manageable in that you work with people who experienced the worst and are now recovering. Whereas with cancer, we might be looking at a different outcome, right? And then I was offered to become the psychologist in a residential addiction rehab hospital in Toronto called Bellwood. And I did an internship there, and my doctorate thesis was there. And after I've been in private practice for a while, they offered me the position. And I was there for about 5 years. And while I was there, they asked me to create a program for Canadian soldiers who dealt with addiction and the outcome or the effects of trauma that they experience, typically overseas. So I did that. I developed a program and I was the clinical director, and that was the focus. So in time, my focus shifted to dealing mostly with all kinds of traumas, and the addiction comes in as a coping strategy, often self-medication, and but there are other outcomes and consequences to trauma. So all of that has been in one form or another part of my practice.
Oh, nice. So you've done a little bit of everything, it sounds
Yeah,
like.
yeah, and more, but I'm giving you just the highlights, I guess.
Right, right. Well, that's great. Yeah, and thank you for all that you've done so far. Can you tell us a little more about your program for the soldiers in addiction?
Sure. So when I was asked to develop that, I started by researching what's out there. And when we talk about addiction and trauma, we're talking about conditions that in the past have been treated separately. And, we called it the revolving door phenomena, where people would go in, let's say, to treat addiction, but they didn't address the trauma, the underlying issue. And, maybe they got sober for a little bit, but then the trauma symptoms led them to relapse. Or they got treated for the trauma or depression or something else that's a result of the trauma. And not addressing the addiction, and they end up again in treatment. So the idea was to develop a program that addressed effectively both at the same time, concurrently. And there wasn't, so we're talking 2004, 2005, and there wasn't really much out there at the time. And so after consulting with, different people in the field, I realized, obviously just talk therapy is not enough. Um, One of the areas that I focused on was developing a program that would offer what we call down regulation techniques. So, beyond the psychoeducation and understanding what's going, in what's happening in their nervous system, and beyond the support, which is very important, um, the reality is that the um, when a person is triggered and has a flashback and relives something, the part of the nervous system, the amygdala, the fear center, takes over, hijacks the the whole system, and at that point, they're not able to um, manage day-to-day activities or manage, a relationship or conflict or whatever they have to deal with. And and so what was lacking was tools that they could not just in the program, but when they leave, take with them and could use when they're activated. And so, and I insisted, by the way, that the program would be the longest we had, which was 9 weeks. I broke it down to 3 cycles, and the focus in the first one was, safety. Making sure that we help them calm down the system, that they're grounded, that they are their withdrawal symptoms are out of the way. And then in the middle of the program, they learned all the tools. We created safe opportunities for them to talk about trauma, but without going into the details, because there is something called vicarious trauma. And when one person tells the details of their traumatic experiences, the other people in the room end up sometimes experiencing vicarious trauma. They imagine it, they feel terrible for that person. And then it becomes part of their sort of memory folder of traumas, right? And so to process traumatic experiences, we did that only one-on-one. The rest of the program was group based, but the trauma processing itself using down regulation techniques. So when I talk about that, it's beyond using, let's say, deep breathing or grounding techniques. I introduced to the program a technique that was, at the time, they described it as an emerging technique, which means there wasn't yet a lot of research. So we couldn't call it evidence-based, right? But the reality is that the only way you would get to the evidence is if you try something, and if it works, you continue to use it, and so on. So when and I'll tell you the context of how we ended up using that technique that I'm talking about. So this is what happened. One of the elements of or the key symptoms of post trauma in men, and in some research says it's the most dominant symptom in men with PTSD is anger. Okay. And that was one area that I felt I didn't have enough tools or even expertise. I could deal with flashbacks and insomnia and nightmares and all sorts of other symptoms, but anger didn't have yet what it took. So again, I researched what's out there, and I heard about this guy, a physician, who was running a group-based sort of anger management program, and he had a really good reputation. So I suggested to the clinical director of all of Bellwood to bring him for a weekend to do it the way he was doing it in outside, to do it for our group, for our first group. Okay, so we had 8 or 9 people in the first group. And I participated. I stayed the 2.5 days, morning till evening, participated in the whole thing and observed, what's going on. So he was using all kinds of tools, even things like punching into a pillow or something, like whatever things I've heard about. And it just wasn't yet getting, from what I could tell, the results. And there was one guy in the program that was just seething with anger. So I observed it before that weekend, and I was worried about him because there could have been a blow up, even with staff. He could have ended up being discharged before he had a chance to learn tools to get better. So we got to the final afternoon on Sunday, and the guy who ran the program said he knew that this guy, he wasn't making any headway with him, and he said, "Okay, I'm gonna try one more thing." And then he taught us a technique I have not heard about, or if I heard it, just sounded so hokey to me that I didn't even look into it. And it's called EFT, Emotional Freedom Techniques, and it involves tapping on acupressure points. So now we're talking about 8 or 9, like tough guys, muscular, macho, right? And we're asking them to do weird things like tapping on acupressure points and saying weird things. Okay, so what am I talking about? Um, you introduce the issue, let's say, and I'll tell you, you wouldn't know who this guy is. So, um, he's the reason he was so angry was when he was serving overseas and obviously going through horrible things. His girlfriend was having an affair with his best friend.
Wow.
Terrible,
Wow.
terrible.
Yeah.
So he finds that out when he comes back. And he was just seething all the time, right? So when the practitioner uh, demonstrated the technique and had him talk about what he was feeling while tapping on acupressure points, you could totally see how, from being red and almost swollen in anger, fuming, he was calming down, and it was like almost like poof. I just could not believe what I'm seeing. And after he did a few rounds of this tapping, the guy said, "You know what? It's okay. I moved on. I'm done. I'm done with her." And everyone, and you could see that he meant it. Like something changed. There was a shift. Call it a cognitive shift. And everyone in the room was like watching in amazement because they could see it was the energy completely changed in the room. Um, so then I said, okay, well, let's see if it lasts. I had the same kind of skepticism that anyone would have with something so new and different and something that seemed to work so quickly. no, it's temporary. It's not gonna last. And it lasted. He stayed. He completed the full program. There wasn't any significant anger. I was just completely blown away. So I
Wow.
said, this is it. I'm taking all my staff to do training in this technique. We did that. I had one more staff member who really took to it, and he and I were the ones who did the one-on-one trauma processing with the clients after that using that technique.
Mhm.
And it was so effective that the medical staff that dealt with these clients on their bases, the different bases in Canada, started calling, asking to talk to me, to ask me what is it that we were doing, because these people were coming back for the first time after treatment, and they've been to multiple treatment programs, but they're different. Something is different. So I knew this is the way to go. And yeah, that's what I mean, down regulation techniques and so on. And so we did things like that in the middle part of the program. And in the last 3 weeks, we focused on preparing them for life after. We invited family members, and so on. And then in follow-ups of the outcome of treatment, what was really shocking was that they had the best recovery outcome than anyone who attended all the other parts of the Bellwood program: alcohol, drugs, gambling, you name it. And in historically, before the program, the soldiers who came with PTSD had the worst outcome.
Yeah. Wow. Wow, that's such an amazing story. I've seen, so I do EMDR with my
Mhm,
therapist, and I've seen uh what you're talking about,
mhm.
and it's just amazing how it works. Like,
Yeah,
it sounds like you wouldn't believe it. You
yeah,
know, you're like, why does this work? And it's just amazing, right?
absolutely.
But
Yeah,
that's so
and
good.
yeah, and while in another group, so I've ran several groups over the
Mhm.
years, and we learned really quickly we couldn't teach EFT to the whole group because they were starting to giggle and so on. We took them on one, but then they would come back after doing an individual session with us and tell the other guys, and they were all like, "Wow, I want to learn this," and also the, their stories of how they manage a symptom that they couldn't manage before, sharing it in the program. I'll give you an example. Um, Also created a buy-in from the others. So, for example, we had one guy who served in Bosnia, horrible, horrible war, and had not been able to sleep since then. Like, he would wake up from nightmares and he would be afraid to fall asleep and so on. And we taught him, tapping. And I told him, when you're not able to sleep or you wake up from a nightmare, I explained to him, just tap. Even if you don't say anything, just do a round of tapping and see what happens. So he comes back one day to the group and says, "Guys, I have to tell you something. You got to listen to this." And he says, "Last night, after I fell asleep, I woke up with a nightmare and I did what Sarah said. I tapped." And he said, "I tapped for almost 4 hours. And then I fell asleep and I had the best sleep of my life. It works."
Wow.
And, you know, things like that. would happen. And, to it felt like miracles,
Yeah.
and it was so effective and so powerful that and luckily the owner, clinical director of the hospital trusted me. She said, I know it's not yet evidence based, but if you think it's worth trying, I'll go with it. Yeah, I know you'll do it responsibly and so on. And with that kind of support, I was able to offer tools that really made a difference. Whereas only talk therapy can actually be harmful in trauma. There's research, and I think it was Bessel van der Kolk who uh, wrote in one of his books. He said, you can take someone with subclinical PTSD, and by just telling them to tell you their story over and over, make them full blown PTSD, right? So we need something that actually changes the nervous system so that it can move from the limbic system, the activation to, be processed with the other side of the brain where the person is able to create a narrative, to put words, to understand the chronology of things. And, then it moves to the hippocampus, the long term memory, and it's no longer, just activated with various triggers.
Right. Oh, that's just fascinating.
Mm.
Just fascinating. And the way you talk about the changes, it's just amazing.
Mhm.
But we should probably say that, a person doesn't they shouldn't just start doing it. They should be guided with it by a therapist, right?
Oh,
And
absolutely,
taught by a
absolutely.
therapist because it's very serious
Yeah,
thing. And if you do it
especially especially with trauma. I mean, the technique can be used to manage, anxiety or sleep difficulties. But when there is underlying post-trauma symptoms,
wrong.
then or even depression, severe depression, you want guidance, at least initially. So what I love about this technique is, yes, initially I teach the clients, but I can also send them with the tool. And it's in the first session, I would give a handout and I would say, at home, you can use it if you're starting to feel really anxious. Don't say anything, just tap, right? But they've already experienced, and we already could tell in the session if this works well for them or maybe they shouldn't yet do it on their own.
Oh,
So, yeah.
that's great. That's great. So so that helped with the addiction, that helped with the trauma because a lot of
Mhm.
people, I feel like when they talk about addiction, especially, they treat the end result, which is the alcoholism or the drug addiction, and they
Mhm.
don't even think about the start and the reason why the addiction happened, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So I'm glad that
And
you said that.
yeah, it's now we call it trauma informed
Mhm.
treatment, where you realize you're dealing with something that's a consequence. So addiction or anger, out of control anger, and so many other possible symptoms of something else, right? And the something else, and we are really going back to what uh, the roots of psychology as a field. Freud initially said very clearly that the root of all symptoms was trauma, right? And since then, we have started to focus more on the consequences of trauma. So anxiety, even OCD, post-trauma, um, addiction, obviously a big one, and 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 so we kind of moved away from the root. And if you're not addressing the root, even if they temporarily get better, and maybe you get rid, let's say, one of the other ways that trauma can manifest is by physiological symptoms. People who have, let's say, repeated headaches, right? So, yes, you might solve that one way or another, but the psyche, the system will find another way to manifest. So, you have to treat the root.
Right, right. Oh, and I love that you brought up the health thing. I think it's so important. I remember when I was younger, people were just starting to talk a little bit about like your physical health being tied to your mental health. And there was such a stigma about that. You wouldn't want people to think that you were sick because of a mental condition or because you have some kind of problem or trauma there that's hiding out. So I like that it's more, people are just more comfortable with it now than
Mm.
I feel like before. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we don't know all the mechanisms of the mind body connection. Certainly, intuitively, we know that. But yeah, there are some really obvious examples of it. And, I gave the example of headache, where, you're, let's say, trying to suppress certain emotions or memories, and even something as simple as one of the many thousands of little nerves in your forehead and your head is tightening, and you develop, let's say, a tension headache. I mean, that's just really easy to connect, right?
Mhm.
But there are other possible mechanisms. People write about hormones and emotions, right? So the hormonal system can be affected. They're looking at the connection between cancer and emotions. I don't think we have proof yet, but again, or it could be so many other conditions. Another easy one is blood pressure, high blood pressure, right?
Oh,
High
yeah.
level of stress, high blood pressure. That leads to other consequences. Irritable bowel syndrome, right? Is another one. There's fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue. Aside from recent discoveries about some brain differences, there seem to be connection to adverse childhood effects, right? Or adverse childhood experiences. And the association, for example, between sleep issues and fibromyalgia, if you're looking at the insomnia and nightmares and so on, then you can see how one can lead to another. So yeah, absolutely.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, that's pretty powerful stuff. So so I wanted to talk a minute about your memoir as well,
Mhm. Yeah,
that's coming out. Can you
yeah.
tell us a little bit about that?
Okay, so my so I was born in Israel, and I came to Canada as an adult. So my both my parents were journalists. They initially started as freelance journalists, and my father ended up being hired by Haaretz, which is a big newspaper in Israel. And while he worked there, when I was not yet 9 years old, it was 1971 in April, um, he published a series claiming that Israel already had organized crime. And not only that, he named people in the article. So you can imagine the consequences of that. So I grew up with police protection, with threats. I didn't quite understand the danger, uh, but over time I did. And over time I realized the different ways that my father's work had affected my life. And so and that's one aspect of it. And he after that, so he published two series on the subject and naming more people in the second series, upsetting more people in the process. He also claimed, I mean, to qualify as organized crime, you have to have connections to politicians, police, and so on. So he also named and suggested politicians and so on. And somehow he ended up being the political analyst of Haaretz and became very powerful too, right? As someone who could shape opinions. So there was that, and he wrote about a lot of different things. Very uh, the kind of topics and the approach that he took created a lot of debate and a lot of controversy, and so it created an unusual childhood that I didn't fully understand. And then I never actually read anything that he wrote until he died. So he passed away in 2013. And I decided so I came to Israel. It was the last 10 days of his life, and went to the Haaretz archive and asked to to read his articles. And as I started to, and they were all cut from they were not digitized at the time. So they were cut pieces in little envelopes. And, I started to unfold them. And literally, my childhood started to unfold as I was reading it. And I remember reading, for example, one of the first articles was about this guy, Omar, an Arab man, who showed up at our house when I was, I think, 5 years old. Suddenly, my parents said, he's going to sleep in your room for a week. Okay. And what was the story, right? So in the article, my father lays out information, and it all came back, right? So that was one of the kind of uh, we call it inciting events, right? The other one was that on the day of my father's funeral, a man showed up before everybody else came, and comes out of his car and asked me, "Are you Ann Kislev's daughter?" And I said, "Yes." And, introduces himself and says, "Hi, my name is," I'm not going to say his name, "and I'm the source." And my brother comes and says, "Oh, you know what he means? That's source for the organized crime series." And I'm like, "What?" Because my father never named who was his source, who gave him all the names and the information, and it's still not known as far as I know. So I ended up interviewing him. So an idea started to form that I would read my father's articles, I'll interview the source, and I'll start to look at what happened in my childhood. So that the memoir, I cover the kind of things, in the first part, I describe memories, events in childhood, the way I remember them before I basically unfolded and unraveled the some of the facts that I didn't know at the time, and so that's the memoir, and of course how it changes, how I remember my childhood, what I think about him, and so on.
Oh, yeah, I see. Now that's called, I went to your website and I
Mhm.
read a little bit that you were talking about your dad on a typewriter.
I posted a short story kind of in my blog. Remember him basically typing back in the day on a typewriter, and yeah, just a little kind of vignette. That's not in the book. That's just its own
Oh, that was
separate
just like a
thing.
little story. And yeah,
Yeah.
I found it fascinating just because, coming from a child's point of view and how you talked about how he would just stop everything and just
Mhm.
put his typewriter and start typing. And I thought about it and I'm like, well, as a child, you probably didn't understand what was going on and what was so important that he had to stop everything. And then
Mhm.
now you're talking about as an adult, kind of reading everything that he wrote. And now you're able to understand a little better.
Yeah, and also I did a lot of research. It took me 12 years. I didn't work on it continuously, and I had two cancers along the way. So there were a lot of interruptions, but I interviewed more people. I found a lot of material online. I he was interviewed on some documentaries and in books about people that he wrote about, and so on. So, in doing that, so, the richness of my story, was expanding all the time. All the additional details, as a kid, your parents go to work, they come back, you might eat dinner with them or whatever, but you don't see the other part of their lives. I felt some of the consequences, and I talk about it, but um, what was happening behind the scenes, and why, there were times they seemed very upset. What was happening? As I researched it, I got the full picture.
Oh wow. Yeah, and that's key I think because a lot of times we don't understand what's going on. And
Mhm.
it can be from a child or an adult and we just don't understand, but it's so important for us to take that time and do some research and see why these things are happening or what's
Yeah,
happening, right?
exactly. And, as human beings, we are all storytellers, but first of all, we need to understand our own story. And when you grow up in unusual circumstances, and your parents or people around you don't tell you what's going on, it leaves confusion, and it leaves, I mean, that feeling of secrets. There were secrets, there were things that I was too young to understand. Um, and so, and as a psychologist, I help other people get, fill in some of these missing pieces. And, I use the metaphor of a quilt in
Mhm.
my book, where, there were a lot of holes in the quilt. And in the process of my research and writing and digging my own memory bank or vault, I started to add patches where there were some holes. So at the outcome is I can see the quilt more fully. I can understand what story, what is my story. actually, not just his.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. It's so important. And I think it's so important for our listeners to hear that you need to talk about things and tell things. I talked earlier in an episode earlier that, when I first had my uh TBI
Mhm,
and getting out of that, nobody really told me what happened and what could be what could happen because of it. Like what
mhm,
parts of my brain were damaged and what that could cause. And
mhm,
because of that misunderstanding, there was a lot about my life and a lot about the things I did and what was happening to me that I didn't fully understand. And
mhm,
then 20 years later, fast forward 20 years later, and I decided to look at my medical records.
mhm.
As I'm looking at them, I'm like, oh, this is why this happened. This is why that happened, kind of filling in those holes, like you said. And I think it's so important to just tell people, you know,
Mhm.
initially. And you don't
Yeah.
have to go into detail,
Mhm.
but like you say, just because you may be too young or you may not be able to fully understand,
Mhm.
but just to give something, because otherwise your mind just creates all these things, right?
Absolutely. And, it's a little bit like misdirection when you're missing a piece and you're running with some kind of explanation. I mean, it can be, especially for children, they could end up feeling that certain things are their fault. They've caused something if nobody explains things to them, or to think they're crazy because they're experiencing something that others do not recognize or cannot explain, and so on. And there are so many negative consequences to uh, growing up not having adults share with you on the level that a child can understand, right? Um, but to keep, otherwise, you really keep them in the dark. And it's enough for children to try and navigate the world. Everything is new, and you're often not sure what to do, and so on. So you don't want to add more things. And so whatever we can do to help and shine light for the children on what's going on rather than keep them in the dark would be much more helpful. Again, in a responsible, developmentally appropriate kind of way.
Right, right. I love that you talk about that. And the name of your book,
Hmm.
in my father's shadows, right?
Yeah, my
Um,
father said.
my father's shadows. And that's even your website. If our listeners want to go to your
Hmm.
website, it's myfathershadows.com, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So so what can you explain? I think a lot of people feel that way, that
Hmm.
that maybe their family members or their parents ideas or lifestyle or whatever it may be can
Hmm.
can take over their lives, right? And leave
Right.
them out a little bit. Can you
Hmm.
talk more about that?
So the meaning in I guess the context of my life and my father, it's manifold. Like there's more than one meaning when I say my father's shadow. So of course his career. I mean, when he published the organized crime series, he became a celebrity overnight. My last name was unique at the time, Kislev. It's a Hebrew month. We lived in Tel Aviv. There was no other Kislev in the phone book. Back in those days, those phone books. And I initially thought it was cool. But later on, what it meant was that if the children of the criminals that he wrote about would know who I am, and they were, as I talk about in the book, I ended up being with some of them in the same school. That that was dangerous, right? So, but also him being a celebrity meant that I was the daughter of. I wasn't me, Sarah. I was the daughter of. As soon as people heard the last name, it was, "Are you related to?" Okay. So that's one aspect of the shadow, but then there's also the kind of secrets and the kind of things, I guess his flaws, his personal failures. That's the Jungian shadow. I'm very much into Carl Jung,
Mhm.
and um, and there's also my shadow. I also share about how my shadow sometimes interacted with his shadow, type things, and there's more to it, but that's the reason I chose that title. And the other layer of that is that he wrote about what you could describe as Israel's collective shadow. So the kind of things that he felt Israel could do better. So, for example, he said, address this early form of organized crime now before it becomes an unmanageable thing, right? Politically, criticizing different things. And he believed in what in the role of a journalist, as in someone who tries to achieve tikkun olam, which is a Jewish value of trying to repair the world. So, so very much focused on uh, identifying what's not working and needs to be corrected. So again, shadow is the theme in the book.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That sounds amazing.
Mhm.
Yeah, so many different things because and talking about shadows, um, there's this thing called shadow work
Mhm.
that sometimes people do, and it sounds to me like that comes into play with your book. Could you talk about the shadow work that somebody
So,
might do?
yeah, so I mean, I think the whole project of working on this is a type of shadow work because I dug deep into both my father's shadow, mine, and even Israel's shadow, because I started to look, on different subjects that he wrote about, and realized there are certain things I didn't even know. um, I'll give an example, and I think it's in the back of the book. I name that as one of the topics. So, my father, again, I was 8 years old when this was happening. He defended a woman, a very famous singer, Jewish, who survived the Holocaust, and she was accused of being a Nazi collaborator. And when she came to perform in Israel, people who accused her threatened that they would show up in a concentration camp uniform in the venues, outside the
Oh,
venue. So the owner said, we're not doing this, and canceled her shows. And so she came to my father, who was Polish too,
wow.
um, and asked him to help her. And he investigated it, right? And
Mhm.
he interviewed so many people. So I follow all of that. And I also, so documentaries, the one that he was interviewed in, a book that was written about her, and so on. So that, and so in doing that it's a shadow work, but on more than just the personal level. It's
Yeah,
social, it's about humanity even as a whole, you
right.
know. And
Yes.
yeah. So, and then my own, in that I then had to examine my behavior
Mhm.
in the context of, looking back at my childhood when I behaved a certain way while not knowing certain things, right?
Mhm.
So that was my piece to look at and shine light on my shadow, not just his.
Oh wow, yeah. There's just this just proves that there's so many different layers to who we are
Mhm.
and to the work we need to do. I think everybody needs to just pause and do a little self-discovery so that they can better understand themselves.
And that's true not just about us individually, but society. These days, especially, we're seeing some of that play out. And really, as a society, we need to reflect and we need to do better.
Yes, yes, definitely. I feel like, yeah, we just need to understand what's going on and
Mhm.
those kind of things, what repercussions decisions that we make can have on others
Mhm.
is
Yeah.
key, right?
Exactly. And own it and try and reconcile when it's needed, and not let these um, forces that are always present in the shadow, like, wanting to tell someone in very crude ways what we think about them, or post something online that could be very hurtful, and so on. We need to acknowledge to ourselves that we feel this way, but then respect other people and how they feel, and so on. So that's, I think, an important part of shadow work. Let's acknowledge, can't suppress it. Carl Jung, he talked about the fact that when we try and suppress what's coming out, they say the anger or the jealousy or resentment, and so on, then it ends up manifesting in all kinds of symptoms. And, instead, if we can acknowledge it, have some outlet to it. I've used art growing up, was my main outlet, which helped me release some of what was going on. And then since I started writing, that has been my primary outlet. And let's just be honest with ourselves, and that's a key element of shadow work. And say, yeah, we all can have even like thoughts of, I want to kill this person, and so on. Doesn't mean we're going to do it. We can acknowledge that we have moments of feeling really angry or jealous or resentful, and accept our whole total humanity, but not act on these. Do better,
Yes,
Mm.
yes. I think that's key just because, like, you have the little, I don't know if it's a rhyme or a limerick, but sticks and stones may break my bones, and words will never
Mhm,
hurt me. And I hate that. As a
mhm,
child, when somebody would say something to you, you would just say that, or whatever. But as an adult, words are powerful and they really do hurt
mhm,
and they really do cause pain and a lot of problems, right?
mhm.
And I think
Yeah,
it's really important for us to just stop and pause and understand those kinds of things.
absolutely. And, if we can all just try and be the best version of ourselves that we can be, then I think the world will be a better place. And for me, the process of writing a memoir, I think, did some of that.
Yeah.
Mhm,
Yeah. I find journaling very healing,
mhm,
and just writing about things. can be
Yeah,
very healing.
yeah. Rather than have the thoughts and feelings float, when you put them on paper, you actually see more clearly, you have insight. Absolutely. It's a very useful tool.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Well, Sarah, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. This is so helpful to our listeners and giving us some techniques and tools and information. Um,
Yeah.
so I
Well,
want to thank you for being with us today.
my pleasure. It was very interesting, and I'm looking forward to, spreading the word further.
Yes, yes. And it's so important. Go out and get Sarah's book, My Father's Shadow. It'll be amazing to read. I know there'll be a lot of information in there that's going to help so many people.
Hopefully. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just want to remind our listeners that you do not have to suffer alone and you have a wonderful day.